There are rules in wars. Most civilizations learn them slowly, through centuries of conflict, through treaties written in blood, through agreements made over the bodies of the dead. Humanity learned them differently. Humanity wrote them once, clearly, permanently. And then they waited for someone to break them. The rules were not complicated. They were not hidden. They were transmitted to every civilization that made contact with human space, in every language those civilizations used, in formats that could not be misunderstood. There were 7 rules. Rule 1 through Rule 6 covered territory, trade, transit rights, and the treatment of prisoners. Rule 7 was different. Rule 7 was 2 sentences. Diplomatic representatives of humanity operate under absolute protection. Any harm to a human diplomat of any kind, under any circumstances, will be treated as an act of war against all of humanity. Not a colony, not a fleet, not a government. All of humanity. For 90 years, no one had broken Rule 7. Then the Tharyn Sovereignty killed Ambassador Elara Voss. And within 72 hours, the galaxy burned. Elara Voss had spent 31 years as a diplomat. She had negotiated 14 treaties. She had prevented 3 wars. She had sat across tables from species that considered humans primitive, inferior, and beneath serious consideration, and had, through patience and precision, convinced them otherwise. She was 54 years old. She had gray in her hair and laugh lines around her eyes and the kind of quiet authority that came from 3 decades of never raising her voice, because she had never needed to. She had arrived at Tharyn Prime 6 weeks earlier. The Tharyn Sovereignty was not a large civilization, 40 systems, a population of roughly 12 billion, a military force of approximately 800 warships, which was respectable but not remarkable. What they had was position. The Tharyn home system sat at the intersection of 4 major trade routes. Every significant commercial corridor between the inner and outer regions of their sector passed through Tharyn space. They had built their civilization on transit fees, tariffs, and the leverage that came from controlling the arteries of regional commerce. For decades, that arrangement had worked. Everyone paid, everyone moved through. Then humanity had begun constructing an alternate route. The Hellion Bypass, a network of relay stations and gate anchors that would allow ships to transit the region without entering Tharyn space at all. A project that had been in development for 12 years and was 6 months from completion. The Tharyn Sovereignty had observed the bypass project with growing alarm. When it was finished, their transit fees would collapse. Their leverage would disappear. Their economy, built entirely on the assumption that they sat at a crossroads that couldn't be circumvented, would face a crisis they had no plan to survive. They had made 3 formal objections. Humanity had responded each time with patient explanations of why the bypass was legal, why it didn't violate any existing agreements, and why the Tharyn Sovereignty would be welcome to negotiate new economic arrangements once it was complete. The Tharyn had not wanted new economic arrangements. They had wanted the bypass stopped. Ambassador Voss had been sent to find a solution, not because humanity believed the Tharyn had legitimate grounds to stop the bypass, they didn't, but because humanity preferred, when possible, to resolve things without conflict. Voss had spent 6 weeks meeting with Tharyn officials. She had proposed 3 different economic frameworks. She had offered preferential trade status. She had suggested joint development projects. The Tharyn had refused all of it. On the 43rd day of her mission, Ambassador Voss had requested a final meeting with Sovereign Chancellor Reith Davar, the head of the Tharyn government. The meeting had been granted. She had gone alone as she always did, no security detail, no armed escort. Rule 7 was protection enough and had always been. She had walked into the meeting chamber. She had not walked out. The official Tharyn account was that Ambassador Voss had suffered a medical emergency. This was not true. What actually happened was reconstructed later from security footage, testimony, and the personal recorder that Voss had worn standard diplomatic equipment, and which had transmitted its final 12 minutes of data to the human diplomatic vessel in orbit before the signal was cut. Sovereign Chancellor Reith Davar had met with the ambassador. The meeting had begun formally, professionally. Then Reith Davar had made a demand. The Hellion bypass would be halted, permanently. All existing infrastructure would be dismantled. In exchange, the Tharyn Sovereignty would allow human vessels to transit their space at reduced tariff rates for the next 50 years. Ambassador Voss had explained calmly she did not have the authority to agree to those terms, that the terms were not acceptable, and that she would be transmitting the Tharyn position to Earth for consideration. Reith Davar had told her that she would not be leaving until she agreed. Voss had looked at him for a long moment, then she had reached for her communicator. Reith Davar had nodded to the guards. The recording ended 11 minutes later. Elara Voss, ambassador of the United Human Authority, died of injuries sustained in the meeting chamber of Sovereign Chancellor Reith Davar of the Tharyn Sovereignty. She had been a diplomat for 31 years. She had never been harmed. Until now, the human diplomatic vessel in orbit received the final transmission from Voss's recorder at 14:32 local time. Captain Demi Ake, commanding the vessel, reviewed the transmission once. Then she transmitted it to Earth. Then she did something that no human diplomatic vessel had ever needed to do in 90 years of operation. She activated Protocol Ember. Protocol Ember was a single encrypted signal. It contained no instructions, no orders, no strategy. It contained exactly one piece of information. Location, time, confirmed hostile action against a human diplomat. That was all it needed to contain. Everything else was already in place. Captain Ake then opened a channel to Tharyn Orbital Control. "This is Captain Demi Ake of the UHA diplomatic vessel Steadfast Accord," she said. Her voice was completely level. "I am transmitting a formal notification under human diplomatic protocols. Ambassador Elara Voss has been killed on Tharyn Prime. Protocol Ember has been activated. This communication is being logged and transmitted to all human authority channels." She paused. "I recommend the immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel from this system," she said. "This recommendation is not a threat. It is advice. I am transmitting it because it is the right thing to do." She closed the channel. Then she sat back in her command chair and looked at the planet below. 40 systems, 12 billion people, 800 warships. She had transmitted Protocol Ember 22 minutes ago. She began to count. On Earth, in the Strategic Command Center, the Protocol Ember signal arrived at 14:54 local time. General Yusuf Adara was on duty. He read the transmission. He reviewed the attached recording. He confirmed the authentication codes. Then he opened the Ember Response Protocol, a document that had been updated annually for 90 years and never used, and began to work through it. The first action took 4 minutes. A signal went out to every human fleet in the Strategic Response Network. Not orders, not coordinates, a single status update. Ember active, standby for coordinates. The second action took 11 minutes. Every human government, every human military command, every human intelligence service received a secure transmission. Not a request for approval, not a consultation, a notification. Ambassador Elara Voss killed on Tharyn Prime. Protocol Ember active. Response commencing per standing authorization. Standing authorization. This was the part that other civilizations never understood about Rule 7. They assumed that a response to a diplomatic killing would require debate, discussion, political process, time. They were wrong. 90 years earlier, when the 7 rules had been written, humanity had spent 3 months deciding what Rule 7 meant in practice, what the response would look like, what authorization was required. The answer they had reached was, no authorization required. The response to a diplomatic killing was not a political decision. It was not subject to debate. It was not something that governments voted on. It was automatic, immediate, predetermined. Because the only way Rule 7 worked, the only way it provided genuine protection, was if every civilization in the galaxy knew with absolute certainty that breaking it would produce an immediate and overwhelming response. Not a considered response. Not a measured response. An automatic ones. The third action took 16 minutes. Coordinates were transmitted to the Strategic Response Network. Tharyn Prime, all associated Tharyn military installations, all Tharyn shipyards, all Tharyn command infrastructure. The fourth action was not an action at all. It was a clock. Protocol Ember specified a 72-hour window between the confirmation of the incident and the commencement of military action. Not because humanity needed 72 hours to prepare, the response network could deploy within minutes. The 72 hours were for the Tharyn. Time to understand what they had done, time to consider their options, time to surrender if they chose to. It was not generosity, it was documentation. When the response came, humanity wanted it recorded permanently that the Tharyn had been given 72 hours and had chosen how to spend them. At 15:11, General Adars transmitted the final notification. It went to every civilization in the region, every government, every military command, every diplomatic channel. It was short. Protocol Ember has been activated in response to the killing of Ambassador Elara Voss on Tharyn Prime. The United Human Authority will commence military action against the Tharyn Sovereignty in 71 hours and 49 minutes. All non-Tharyn vessels are advised to clear the system. This notification will not be repeated. On Tharyn Prime, Sovereign Chancellor Reith Davar received the notification 40 minutes after it was sent. He read it once. Then he convened an emergency session of the Sovereignty Council. The session lasted 9 hours. The debate covered 3 positions. The first position, surrender immediately, release a formal apology, offer reparations, surrender Reith Davar personally to human justice, do whatever was necessary to stop the response. The second position, negotiate, use the 72 hours to open diplomatic channels, find a middle ground, offer the Hellion bypass halt as a concession. Surely humanity would rather have a political victory than a military one. The third position, fight, 800 warships, 40 systems, fortified positions. Humanity would face real resistance, real casualties that might make them reconsider. Reith Davar listened to all 3 positions. He chose none of them. He chose something worse. He chose to wait and see. He convinced himself that the 72-hour window was a negotiating tactic, that humanity would not actually attack a 40-system civilization over one diplomat, that the response when it came, if it came, would be limited, proportionate, something that could be survived. He had never read the full history of Protocol Ember. He had never read about the civilizations that had harmed human diplomats before the protocol was formalized. The ones in the early years of human expansion, when the rules were new and untested. He did not know what had happened to them. He was about to find out. At exactly 71 hours and 49 minutes after General Adara's notification, the gates opened. Not above Tharyn Prime alone. Above every Tharyn system simultaneously. All 40 of them. Human warships poured through in numbers that overwhelmed every sensor array the Tharyn possessed. The deployment had been planned with exact precision. Every Tharyn military installation, every shipyard, every command facility had been assigned a specific human fleet element. There was no overlap, no wasted movement, no hesitation. The Tharyn fleet scrambled. 800 warships, distributed across 40 systems, suddenly facing a force that outnumbered them so catastrophically that individual ship counts became meaningless. In the home system, where 300 of the Tharyn's best warships were concentrated, they faced 4,000 human vessels in the first wave alone. Supreme Admiral Kevator, commanding the Tharyn home fleet, looked at her tactical display for exactly 6 seconds. Then she opened a channel to the human fleet. "We surrender," she said. The human admiral who appeared on her screen was a young man. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had not slept well. "Accepted," he said. "Power down weapons and propulsion, all ships immediately." It took 11 minutes for the entire Tharyn home fleet to comply. In those 11 minutes, 14 Tharyn warships attempted to flee, 12 were disabled, 2 were destroyed. In the other 39 systems, the story was similar. Some Tharyn commanders surrendered immediately, some fought. None of them achieved anything by fighting except their own destruction. By hour 4 of the operation, every Tharyn military asset in every Tharyn system had been neutralized. Not destroyed, neutralized. Humanity had the capability to destroy. They had chosen not to. This was deliberate. The Ember Protocol was not designed to punish a civilization for one act by destroying it. It was designed to demonstrate, with absolute clarity, the cost of breaking Rule 7. That cost was the complete and total elimination of military capability, every warship disabled or captured, every shipyard seized, every weapons manufacturing facility shut down, every military command structure dissolved. Not deaths. Omnipotence. The Tharyn sovereignty would exist, its people would live, its government would function. But for the next 100 years, under the terms that would be dictated to them, the Tharyn would have no military, no weapons, no ability to project force anywhere against anyone. They would be, for a century, exactly as vulnerable as Ambassador Elara Voss had been when she walked into that meeting chamber alone. That was the response. That was what Rule 7 meant. On Tharyn Prime, Sovereign Chancellor Reith Davar was arrested by his own security forces 6 hours into the operation. They had watched the tactical feeds. They had watched 4,000 human warships appear. Above their homeworld, they had watched their fleet surrender in 11 minutes. They had made a calculation. The calculation was, Reith Davar is not worth it. He was turned over to human authority 19 hours after Protocol Ember commenced. The human officer who accepted custody was a lieutenant, young. She accepted the transfer with the same paperwork she would have used for any other prisoner processing. Reith Davar had expected something, anger, satisfaction. A moment of human emotion that he could read, could understand, could use to assess what came next. As he got paperwork. You'll be transported to a human judicial facility, the lieutenant said, reviewing her documents. The charges will be formally filed within 30 days, trial within 18 months. I want to speak with someone in authority, Reith Davar said. You'll be assigned legal representation, she said. They can help you identify who you need to speak with. I want to explain. That's what the trial is for, she said, not unkindly, just factually. She completed her paperwork. He was transported. The 72-hour window and everything that followed were observed by approximately 40 civilizations. Every government in the region had received the initial notification. Every military command had tracked the deployment. Every intelligence service had counted the ships. The numbers were discussed in chambers of government across hundreds of light years. The speed was what affected people most. Not the size of the response, though that was staggering. Not the precision, though that was remarkable. The speed. 71 hours and 49 minutes from notification to first gate opening. An operation spanning 40 systems, coordinated simultaneously, executed without error. That kind of response didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen because humanity had gotten lucky with their fleet positioning. It happened because humanity had been ready for it, for 90 years. Had built the capability, maintained the capability, drilled the capability for a moment that hadn't come until now. In the Hall of Consensus on Varath Station, the ambassadors of 11 regional civilizations met in emergency session 3 days after the operation concluded. The Varath ambassador opened the discussion. The question before us, she said, is what we have learned. An ambassador from the Quellan Confederation spoke first. We have learned the obvious lesson. Rule 7 is real, the response is not a bluff. We knew that, another ambassador said. The historical record was clear. The historical record described smaller incidents, a third said. Early in human expansion, before their full capability was established, we assumed. We assumed incorrectly, the Varath ambassador said. That is the lesson. We assumed the capability had limits, that at some scale, at some point, the response would be proportionate rather than overwhelming. We were wrong. Silence. What I want to understand, the Quellan ambassador said, is the 72 hours. Why give them the time? If the response is automatic, if no authorization is required, why wait? No one answered immediately. Finally, an older ambassador from the Sarath Union, a civilization that had been observing human expansion for longer than most, spoke. I asked a human official that question once, she said. Years ago, during a trade negotiation, I asked why Rule 7 specified 72 hours. What did they say? The Sarath ambassador looked at her hands for a moment. She said, the 72 hours aren't for us, they're for the historical record. When the response comes, we want it documented permanently in every archive that we gave them the time, that we told them exactly what was coming, that they had the choice. The hall was quiet. She said, we don't want anyone to be able to say 1,000 years from now that humanity acted without warning, without patience, without giving the other side every possible chance. Another silence. And then what did she say? The Quellan ambassador asked. The Sorath ambassador looked up. She said, and then we respond anyway, because Rule 7 doesn't have exceptions, and the 72 hours are the only mercy in it. 3 months after the operation concluded, a memorial was built on Earth. It was not large, a garden in a city near the ocean, a single stone at the center, her name on it. Elara Voss, Ambassador, 31 years in service, killed on Tharyn Prime. She went alone because she had never needed protection before. She goes with us now. The memorial service was attended by 14 of the 15 ambassadors she had negotiated treaties with. The 15th sent a message. He was very old and couldn't travel. His message was read aloud. It said she was the most patient person I ever met. She made me feel every time that we had all the time in the world to get it right. I did not know until the end how much courage that patience required. General Yusuf Adara attended the service. He stood at the back. He had not slept well in 3 months. He had activated Protocol Ember. He had sent the notification. He had watched 40 systems fall silent in under 4 hours. He did not regret it. He had done what the protocol required, what Elara Voss's death required. But he thought about the 72 hours, about Davar waiting and calculating and convincing himself it would be manageable. About the moment those gates had opened. About whether any of it could have gone differently. He didn't know, he was not sure it mattered. The protocol existed because the alternative, a galaxy where human diplomats could be killed without consequence, was worse. Far worse. Well, he knew that. He still didn't sleep well. Captain Demi Ake received a commendation for her actions aboard the Steadfast Accord, for activating the protocol, for transmitting the notification. She accepted it quietly. She had done her job. She had followed procedure. She had transmitted the advice to evacuate because it was the right thing to do. She thought about that sometimes. She had given them the advice. She had told them to leave. She had done it sincerely, as she had said. Some of them had taken the advice. Some of them hadn't. She couldn't decide how she felt about the ones who hadn't, whether they had been brave or foolish or simply disbelieving, whether they had looked at the Steadfast Accord in orbit and seen a ship, a crew, a captain, and not been able to make themselves believe that what was coming was real. She understood that in a way. It was hard to believe until you saw it. In the Tharyn Sovereignty, the first years without a military were difficult. Not because of external threats, no civilization tested the terms of the Ember settlement. The terms were clear. Any attempt to rebuild a military capability would result in the immediate resumption of human operations. No one tested that. The difficulty was internal. A civilization that had built its identity around the power of its position, the crossroads, the leverage, the ability to control who moved through their space, was now learning to exist without any of that. It was, in its way, the most thorough possible response to what Davar had done. He had killed a diplomat to stop a project that would remove Tharyn leverage. The project was completed 8 months later. The Hellion bypass opened on schedule. Ships transited freely. Tharyn transit fees collapsed as projected. And the Tharyn Sovereignty, stripped of its military, stripped of its leverage, stripped of everything Davar had tried to protect, had to find another way to exist. It took decades, it was painful. It required rebuilding almost everything. But they did it. New leaders, new economy, new identity, built on something other than the ability to make others pay for passage. Built on something that couldn't be bypassed. 40 years later, the Tharyn ambassador to the human diplomatic service was a young woman named Soverel. She had been born after the operation. She had grown up in the new Tharyn. She spoke 6 languages and had negotiated 2 regional trade agreements before her 30th birthday. She visited the memorial garden on Earth on the anniversary of Ambassador Voss's death. She stood at the stone for a long time. Then she placed a flower at the base of it, a flower from Tharyn Prime. I am sorry, she said, not to anyone in particular, not for effect. Just to the stone, just to the name. Elara Voss, Ambassador. Just because it needed to be said. Somewhere in a human strategic command archive, the protocol Ember file for the Tharyn operation was closed and filed. It joined a small collection, the early incidents, the ones from before the protocol was formalized. All of them together, they told a story. The story was simple. Humanity had sent diplomats because they preferred peace, had written rules because they believed in order, had built a response capability because they understood that some things, some actions, could not be met with patience or negotiation or compromise. Some things had to be met with absolute certainty. The certainty that it would always cost more than it was worth. The certainty that the cost would always be paid. The certainty that somewhere, in a facility that had been maintained and updated and drilled for 90 years, a protocol sat ready, waiting, and that the moment it was needed, the moment someone looked at a human diplomat and made the wrong calculation, it would activate without hesitation, without debate, without mercy. And the galaxy would burn within 72 hours. As every time